Magic.me is the world's greatest school for magic, meditation, and mysticism. You can learn everything there, from chaos magic to hermeticism to meditation to how to supercharge your finances and take absolute control of your destiny. In short, you get all of the tools you need to turn chaos into beautiful, scintillating order and master your life. It's incredible. You've probably heard me talk about it on the show quite a lot. But check it out. It's growing fast. And I just want to say, if you're confused about where to start, because I have so many courses there, the Adept Initiative is the place to go. The Adept Initiative is the flagship course on Magic.me, and it contains everything you need to know to master the most profound ancient techniques of changing your consciousness and the most modern and cutting-edge tools and systems for absolutely turning your life into a masterpiece. You are really going to dig it. Go check it out, and I will see you in class. It's magic.me, magick.me. All right, well, why don't we just get into it? Maybe if you want to talk a bit about who you are and your latest book for the audience.
Yeah. So my name is Matt Oren. I wrote a book called Psychic Witch, and I just followed it up with Mastering Magic, which is sort of the companion sequel, though you can start with either book first, but they do work in tandem together. I have a very extensive background in the occult and magic in general. And I was a professional psychic for many, many years, including in Salem, Massachusetts. And I started doing workshops and teaching about psychic ability and tarot and stuff like that. And eventually it just kind of led to Llewellyn being like, hey, when are you going to write us a book? So I wrote a book, and that ended up being what I do.
Yeah, being very successful, which is cool. So were you interested in psychic stuff or, hermetic or more occult stuff first?
So I would say I was interested in witchcraft first, because my draw to this stuff started very, very early. I opened Mastering Magic with sort of my childhood origin story. So I always kind of gravitated towards anything witchy, which led to anything sort of psychic, and then just kind of went from there. Okay. Like I remember in elementary school going through my school library, checking out every book on witches that they had, which for an elementary school library doesn't have many results. Like you get like Roald Dahl and stuff like that. But they had one book. It was Roald
Dahl is censored now, and they probably have taken all the witchcraft books out of schools. Hopefully not, but yeah.
Yeah, probably, sadly. But there was one book. It was one of those like Time Life like books, and it was on witchcraft. And it was all about like folklore and stuff of that nature and like fairy tales. And then at the very end, it had one little, like, it was like 2 or 3 pages about modern day witchcraft. And so you had what you would expect. You had like Anton LaVey and Aleister Crowley. And then they had a picture of Maxine Sanders on a hill with her initiates. You know exactly the picture I'm talking about.
I do. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to that were imprinted by that image as young people or teenagers, and it's you know what it is that turns people. It's either the Maxine Sanders stuff, or it's the female succubus in the first edition Dungeons and Dragons Monster Manual for some reason.
That's funny.
Yeah, I love those Time Life books, though. I've still got mine. I had the ones on Unsolved Mysteries and Aliens and all that.
Yeah. They had a couple series. Like they had the Enchanted World series, and then they had the like Unexplained Mysteries, which was more the psychic.
That's right. I remember the Enchanted World one, too. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Great stuff.
Yeah. So, and it's I don't know. My childhood's really interesting because I've been reflecting a lot on my childhood and sort of the things that I feel were kind of like seeds along the way of who I would become or what experiences I would have. And so I've been thinking about that time life one a lot, because I ended up meeting Maxine Sanders as an adult.
What was that like?
It was actually very, very surprising. She was fantastic, complete lady, very intelligent, very classy, wicked sense of humor, which is what you don't expect, right? Because she looks like, a very proper woman at her age in life now, as compared to when she was younger, with the Alexander pictures.
Yeah, when did Alex Sanders died a while ago, didn't he?
Yeah, I don't know the exact date, but yeah, he's been gone for a while.
The king of the witches.
Yeah.
Maybe actually, for those who don't know Maxine and Alex Sanders, if you want to mention a little bit about why they were so important, because maybe people don't know about them now. Hopefully they do, but you know how it is.
So they are the second biggest form of British traditional Wicca. You have the Gardnerians, which is Gerald Gardner's group. And then you have Alex Sanders, which popped up later. And Alex Sanders really made Wicca and witchcraft more noticeable, in my opinion, than Gerald Gardner, because Alex Sanders had a little bit more of that kind of Anton LaVey thing, where he was totally about like, turn on the cameras, let's do the documentaries, let's, kind of get people's attention. And they would even do like live rituals and initiations, and like all of it was staged to like protect the initiatory stuff. But he definitely popularized it on a level that hadn't been popularized. I'm not an Alexandrian initiate, so I can't really speak to a lot of the details of that tradition, but I would say that was like the biggest thing. I know that the Alexandrian tradition has a lot more of the ceremonial magic put into their witchcraft than the Gardnerians do. I believe that they're all into like the more like planetary and Enochian and that sort of stuff kind of woven into their witchcraft.
Yeah, it's always interesting to me because the witchcraft traditions have been, at least as an outsider observing them, like fairly stable and consistent all along, as opposed to more, Golden Dawn or Thelemic or occult groups, which notoriously blow out almost immediately upon formation, and are just, there's lots more gaps in the resume, so to speak, which is interesting. So in engaging with that stuff early on, what was do you feel like that was what opened up your interest in the psychic world? Do you feel that it opened up psychic ability for you? Or was that something that you kind of went into it already having?
Well, I would have to back up a little bit.
Yeah.
So I was a foster care kid. I opened Mastering Magic with this story. And because my parents were addicts. So we were in the foster care system. My older brother and we were separated. And then my grandfather and his wife ended up getting custody of us, which was great because we had stability and all that stuff. But my grandfather was, I guess, abusive would be the word, on different levels. And it's weird to talk about because at the time it doesn't feel like it. But I remember one day I came home from school and the teacher had called saying I was being disruptive. And so as punishment, I had to go into my bedroom. I had to stay in my bed without electricity until he said I was allowed to. So this was a Friday, and it extended at least until Wednesday. Like I couldn't even get up to go to the bathroom. So like I'm a little child. I'm like Jesus. 7, I think, at this point.
Yeah.
So I had nothing. I don't want to like do the comparison, but the closest I can compare it to is like shamanic death, because I could do nothing. I'm this little kid. All I have is my mind to play with, and the only escape I had was dreams. So I began thinking things like, well, what is it like to transition from this state of consciousness to dreaming? Like, how do I go from here to there? So I started paying attention to those things. And then I started to notice that like I could get a palpable energy between my hands, just stuff that I wouldn't have noticed if I wasn't forced into this sort of like non-activity. And then I started seeing what I call spirits coming through the room. And most of them like didn't care about me, like they didn't pay attention. It was sort of like they were just walking through, but a couple would stop and stare, never say anything, but then left. So after this experience, this opened a whole can of questions for me. And my grandparents were really strictly religious. They were Assembly of God, which is two of the most extreme Protestant Christianities married together. It's Pentecostal and evangelical.
Yo. Okay. It's quite a combo.
So like I was having these experiences that were completely contradictory to like what I was being taught. And then one day, I think like a year or two later, I somehow snuck up and I was watching TV when I wasn't supposed to. So I had free reign because no one was watching me. And I saw the movie The Craft. And I know it's so cliche and it's such a joke to be like, oh, you watched The Craft and then thought you were a witch. But for me, it woke something up in me. Like there was sort of this weird recognition and draw to it. So that's when I started searching my library for like any book at my elementary school. And I ended up from that picture, from the subtitle under Maxine Sanders, learning the word Wicca. So I was armed with a word, and I don't identify as Wiccan today, but I was armed with the word and I sought out the books, and I got Silver Ravenwolf books and Scott Cunningham books, that were accessible to me. And this is part of what I'm talking about, like how I've been thinking a lot about my childhood, because one of the things I used to do on my free time, because I had this all hidden like it was pornography or something, right?
Okay.
It's like there's no way in hell my grandparents were going to be cool with it. So I would have these notebooks and I would like pretty much plagiarize their works and pretend that I was writing my own witchcraft books with the Llewellyn crescent on the spine and all of that.
Wow.
And it's funny because now I have my books with the crescent moon on the side, and Silver Ravenwolf wrote the foreword to my last book. And Scott Cunningham's not with us anymore, but his sister was like, hey, Matt, will you do the foreword for his biography I just wrote? So it's like all these weird little like seeds that seem to have like turned into something that, didn't seem like anything initially. And I find that really, really fascinating.
That is fascinating. I mean, it sounds like from a lot of the touch points you've mentioned, it sounds like we're probably about the same age and have some shared experiences. I definitely remember when The Craft came out, one of my friends, we were both super goth at the time, and one of my friends decided that he wanted to become Fairuza Balk, and I mean like literally become her and dress like her and everything. And he ended up like doing like a Wiccan initiation for both of us in like an empty swimming pool in the neighborhood. And at the time it was really goofy, but now I look back and I was like, well, technically that's my first initiation, so here we are, like, a bit later.
So I totally did that. So I totally like not knowing what I was doing.
I think it was from that Raymond Buckland book.
Yes, I didn't get into Buckland until later on, and I wasn't super into it. And I think like I get the significance of that book in history, especially since it was like one of the only books at the time. But I feel blessed to have been raised with the opportunity to have like Ravenwolf and Cunningham and things that like explained it in a way that my childhood brain could understand. Like I know I bought, when I was really young, I bought a copy of Modern Magic by Donald Michael Craig.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the reason I bought it was badass cover, and it had an endorsement by Silver Ravenwolf. I did not understand anything in that book as a kid.
I got that I think in my late teens and started working through it, which probably is how so many people get started or go further in. And I was lucky enough to meet Don Craig shortly before he died in Los Angeles, because I was working with his wife at a company you probably know, actually, California Psychics, or somewhat well. Okay, anyways, it's a corporation that does psychic readings. But I got to meet Don Craig, and I'll never forget. He said the funniest thing to me, which we were talking about using drugs for magic. And I said like, well, it's like, well, I kind of like keeping my brain cells. And you just looked at me and was like, that's what they're for. Like brain cells are for burning out. And he was
Wow.
very sweet in person.
That's funny. Yeah, he passed before I revisited his book, because I don't think I revisited his book until I was a young adult. And then I could start kind of making sense of it. And now it's kind of funny because like I consider it kind of a beginner's book,
It
you
is,
know,
yeah,
from where I am.
yeah.
But when I was like a child, it was like an alien language, you know. I had no idea what the fuck it was trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah, for
Had a
sure.
cool cover though.
Yeah, the new edition is even cooler, I think, like the big splat book with the new cover. So, but then I'm guessing, you know, like as things went on, you got into it in a more structured fashion.
Yeah. So I was into it up until like high school. And then high school, I went through my super goth phase, you know, though I would never say I'm goth because goths don't say that they're goth.
Right.
That's
That's
you know,
the Andrew Eldritch way. You have to violently
yeah,
deny it.
exactly. And so, you know, I was super into Anton LaVey and like atheism. And then after high school, I had experiences that eventually put me kind of back on the spiritual path, but not quite witchcrafty yet. So I got super into like Reiki and yoga and like Eastern stuff. And I started exploring some of the like core shamanism stuff based on some of the experiences that I had. And I bought a book when I was living in Massachusetts. This was like maybe 12 years ago or so. I don't need, time is such a blur now, but it was the Shamanic Temple of Witchcraft by Christopher Penczak.
Yeah.
And I was reading it, and my partner at the time was like, "Hey, Christopher lives like right around the corner. He has like a temple." I'm like, "Are you kidding? Are you kidding?" So I emailed Christopher, like I pretty much stalked him online and got his contact information and messaged him, and he was super nice. And he's like, "Oh, we're going to have an open house, you know, next weekend if you want to come to the Temple of Witchcraft and check it out." So I went there. We both kind of fell in love with it. We started training with them. And then I went back because he was trained initially by Laurie Cabot. He's a Cabot high priest, and then he went off to do his own thing to expand on it. And so I was like, well, I want to learn from Laurie. So I went and I studied with Laurie. And then from there, I was like, I want to learn from everyone I can. And so that got me super into witchcraft. And then I started expanding into like ceremonial magic and Thelema. And I don't really have a word for what I am other than like witch.
Maybe a better,
really.
yeah, I mean, what do you even say after a certain point? Maybe a better question to ask is, what was the point at which you felt confident enough to start writing, you know, to start putting books out and writing professionally? Like you felt, was there like a switch where you felt you had crossed a certain point where you felt a mastery of the material?
Well, mastery is a weird word, which is interesting.
Confidence in communicating it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So I was reading for many years at one of the biggest profile stores in Salem, which was Laurie Cabot's shop. And I got to read next to her. And she was prolific because she had the book Power of the Witch, which was really big. She was on Oprah, and she was one of those kind of like movers and shakers of the witchcraft movement in the 90s. And she was on Unsolved Mysteries for finding missing bodies for the police and stuff like that. And I with all my training, I got really, really good as a psychic reader. And to the point where my clientele was just filled up completely, you know, and it had like musicians and actors, and like it started getting really like high lists. So I kept raising my price to sort of try to like dwindle down like how many people are coming in. And I kept raising it and raising it and raising it. And I was like, okay, well, this isn't backing off. So I'm going to just start teaching people how to do it for themselves. So I started doing workshops to teach people, like, this is how you can be psychic yourself. Because one of the things that made me really popular as a reader was it wasn't a straight tarot reading. Like, a lot of it was psychic based and mediumship based. And the cards just kind of filled out a little bit of more information, you know. So I felt very confident in my own ability to teach it. And then I had a Patheos blog on just witchcraft and paganism in general. And that ended up being the most popular one on the channel at the time. And then that's when Llewellyn approached me and was like, hey.
Interesting. So it was by public demand then.
Yeah. So, I'm very big on, you know, not writing about stuff that I don't know. A lot, because sometimes, and I don't want to make this judgment, but I totally have this judgment where I read particularly witchcraft books, and I'm like, have you ever tried this spell that you're sharing with people, or this exercise?
I feel that way about a lot of writing about magic. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm very, like, even if I'm experimenting, you know, I need to have test driven it with good results for a couple times before I share it.
That's great. I mean, that's if I'm writing in that mode, which I don't do a whole lot of yet, but I do teach. I only teach from my own experience. So that's really cool. Well, I would really be curious, and I think probably the audience would be curious, to talk about, you mentioned kind of how to explore being psychic or opening that up for yourself. That, I think, would be really, really interesting if you wanted to talk about that. Because I think that, I'm sure you've had the same experience. There's not a lot of, sometimes there's kind of no overlap between the magical and psychic communities. You know, it's like magicians aren't psychic and psychics it's like magicians have the structure to project, but they're not inherently psychic. So they're relying on substances or something. And psychics don't have the structure of ritual magic. So they're blown out and all over the place sometimes.
Exactly. And so the interesting thing is they used to be united in occultism. Like the Victorians were all about it, right? Like you go back to the Victorian occult writings, they have a strong emphasis on psychic ability, a strong emphasis on the inner planes, on, you know, the power of imagination and the power of the mind, you know, without, going into this weird kind of dichotomy I see in occultism where they're like, oh, it's either Jung or it's real. And it's like, okay, well, maybe you should read some Jung to like understand that's not what he's saying at all. But I even with the psychic books, I was a little bit frustrated reading them because I felt like a lot of the exercises would be kind of vague and it'd be like, this is kind of how to open your intuition. And like, it wasn't very specific. It wasn't about hard driven results. So based on my experiences, my research, my training, and then my own experiments, I developed what's in Psychic Witch. Like for Laurie Cabot's tradition. So when you go through Witchcraft 1, the first test before you're allowed to be initiated, this isn't like a secret, so I'm allowed to share it, is we're taught how to health scan someone. So essentially what we do is we go and we find people in our lives who have a doctor diagnosed problem with them, condition or whatever. And we fill out pretty much an information sheet and we keep it to ourselves. We don't show anyone. And we're trained to say the name of the person to the other person, their age and their location. And just based off those three information, you have to describe them and you have to diagnose them correctly. And the person obviously has it written down as proof.
That's a hell of a test.
And everyone passes. Like that's the thing. Everyone passes.
How much training are people doing before that test?
It depends. I think she's kind of boiled it down from the original size, but not very long. I mean, it's basically going into alpha and then going into immersion. I'm super big on immersion. And I think that is a huge key to psychic ability, and it's our biggest hang up.
Say more about that in terms of what you mean by specifically going into alpha and how you do that and how you experience, and then what you mean by immersion.
Okay, yeah. So alpha is a brainwave state that is associated with imagination. It's associated with daydreaming. It's not like being asleep, and it's not being in a trance state or like a drug-induced state, like a hallucinatory state. It's essentially that same state of mind when either your mind wanders, or if you're really into something, you're kind of like in that flow state or in the zone, right? It's different than beta. Like beta is what I'm in right now as I'm talking to you and I'm thinking, and my talker's on. But alpha is associated with that sort of like liminal space where you're here in the physical reality, but you're not. Like your mind is either focused on, so what I always want to go to is writing. When I write, I go into alpha because I'm totally focused on what's going on in my head as I'm typing. So it's interesting because a lot of these old occultists, even going back to like Agrippa, mention imagination and the power of imagination. And you go into Hermeticism and it's all about mind and the power of the mind, and what's interesting is there's a researcher, and his name escapes me right now, of course, because I'm doing an interview. But he essentially took different people from different faiths, different like faith healers and shamans and, voodoo priestesses and all these different people who claim to be tapped into something different. And he put them on the ECG machines, the brainwave scanners, and he would have them do their thing, whatever it was. And he noticed consistently that when they would go into the thing, they would go into that alpha brainwave state.
Okay.
So he drew a connection that state of mind has something to do with all these abilities that these people are tapping into, which is interesting because it can be seen as either psychic or magic, what they're doing, different vocabulary, but it's either one or the other.
I'm guessing that's the same state that people are in when they're being artists as well. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Interesting.
Well, because art is magic, in my opinion.
And often predicts the future.
Or it creates it.
Right.
Like Grant Morrison and the whole hypersigil.
Yeah.
Yeah. So essentially, it's an easy state to get into. Like we slip in and out of it all day long without realizing it. But essentially, if you close your eyes and you relax and you kind of go inward for a moment, you can trigger it intentionally. And in this state, so my theory is, and I don't go super in depth into the book, but my theory is it creates sort of a bridge between the conscious and the subconscious, which is then tapped into the collective unconscious. So I think that's where that sort of psychic information comes from. I am a big proponent of the tripart soul model. That was in my witchcraft traditions. As I dive deeper into occultism, I'm like, why isn't it in every witchcraft tradition?
Say more about what that is. I haven't heard about that before. Okay.
You probably have, I guarantee you have, just probably not under that name.
Okay. All right.
So it's the idea of a higher self, a lower self, and a middle self. So Plato, his model was the spirited, the souled, and the rational aspects of self.
Yep.
So it's this idea that in witchcraft, we refer to all three parts as a soul to emphasize the divinity of all three of them. So for me, I believe that intuition, like what we call intuition, is our lower self speaking to our middle self, because our lower self is our animal self, right? Like it's our body, it's the part of us that is an animal. And animals, which we are constantly scanning their environment for information. But a lot of the information that we scan is subconscious because of the way that we've evolved. We don't see it necessary to pick up on all those details. Like if you've ever seen BBC Sherlock,
Like one episode. This is the one with Benedict
Yes.
Cumberbatch in it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. So, and I'm sure you saw it because it's in every episode, but when he does his deductions,
Oh, right.
all of a
Yeah.
sudden he's like, there's a scuff on his arm and, there's a thing here and there, these things that like no one would normally pick up. Like we're all constantly picking up is my belief. So intuition is that information and we feel it in our animal bodies, in our lower self. We feel it either as an emotion that's unprocessed or as a physical sensation. Psychic ability, I believe, is the higher self speaking to the middle self. So this is the stuff that can't be explained by any environmental factors. This is where like names and dates and just like, that kind of information that's, like, where did that come from? So
Right.
I believe that's.
Yeah, that's interesting because I've kind of come to the same conclusions, or came a while ago, came to the same conclusion about what you're saying about intuition, that you're really kind of picking up on infinite information, and then your body may be representing it to you as a feeling, but it's an amalgam of so many things that you're kind of tuning out. But then the higher self talking, I mean, just in my experience being around truly psychic people, it is uncanny what people can pick up on and tell you. I mean, it's they're truly tapping into, I don't know what to call it, a higher level of reality where they can see information. And I take it seriously, and I don't discount it like obviously so many people do. But of course, I think the most successful psychics that I've met, because I've worked for companies that work with psychics, I've met a lot and talked to a lot and interviewed a lot. The most successful ones, I think, kind of go through training programs, because otherwise I've also met a lot of psychics who just they can't differentiate between themselves and other people's problems. And
I talk about that in my book, and I talk about it in the book that's coming out soon. I tap onto two different parts of that. So like in Psychic Witch, the way that I talk about it is I talk about magical impact. So I see magic and psychic ability as the same thing. It's just two sides of the same coin, right? Like magic is, the way I define it is the wielding and projection of energetic information to change reality.
Mm-hmm.
Where psychic ability is the perception of that energetic information.
Yeah, I just see it as projection and reception.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing. It's just like input or output. But I totally forgot what I was talking about.
Oh, we were talking about, or I was talking about psychics without clear boundaries.
Oh, yes. So magical impact is a term that Josephine McCarthy of Quaera, I think is what her books and her mystery school is called. She coined the term, to my understanding. And it's essentially what I think happens to a lot of psychics and a lot of people that you meet that are into new age stuff or super into the psychedelic scene, because it's very similar to old hippies, where you have the burnout hippies, mm-hmm. right? So the same thing happens to psychics or even magical practitioners, where essentially they fry themselves because they're not properly handling the energy. They're not grounding it right. They're taking on too strong of things. And so like, all of a sudden you have someone having like, these spot on psychic things and these great revelations. And then all of a sudden they're talking about like, reptilian shape-shifting, bankers, and you're like, what? Or they're just like not connected. They're just totally right. all about like, 5D, galactic command, and you're like, what's 5D mean? And they're like, it's this vague,
It's tricky, as I'm sure I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here. It's like this culture doesn't really recognize any of these experiences, yet they're so obviously, to my mind, they're so obviously real, and B, have been part of the human experience since the beginning of the human experience. They're part of being human.
Right.
And, we live in a culture which wants to deny and cut them off. And that's not, it's extremely unhealthy, and B, it's very dangerous for the people who will obviously and naturally gravitate to those things because it's part of the human experience. It's just you can't edit it out of, even when you're talking about your childhood experiences. It's like, you can't just block off that level of things, or maybe you can. People tried. People seem to, but that's not particularly healthy. So one of the reasons why. One of the reasons why I do what I do, particularly with teaching, is I got into that zone in my late 20s where I fried myself and nobody could help me. And like nobody knew what was going on with me. And that was very and it took like a long time. And seeking, it was like the second phase of my, first I sought to get into magic and psychic stuff and go through that. And then I had to seek to get out of it, So I guess that's part of the shamanic journey. But this is one of the reasons I teach, so that people can have a structure and not fry themselves, hopefully.
Yeah. That's why a psychic witch, I'm very, very focused on like how to turn this off, how to turn this down, how to handle the energy properly. Because that's one of the things that I found was missing in a lot of the books that I grew up on and the ones that I could find in the market, that I had to learn through A, experience, and then B, just from people who were experienced, from teachers and mentors, stuff that should be in books, but isn't in books.
Well, maybe if you want to share more about that, because I think that's such important information. I think the way I want to phrase the question is, what are the warning signs that you're kind of getting close to? First, it's what exactly causes being fried? Second is, what are the warning signs that you're kind of pushing it too far? And third is, how to turn it off.
Okay. That's a lot of questions.
Yes. Okay. We can go through one at a time and I'll keep track of them.
So, I mean, I think the warning signs are more apparent to people around you than maybe yourself. Just because there's a disconnect from reality that starts slowly happening. In the sense of, just kind of neglecting and not caring about things around you and being completely focused on it. Like that's one red flag that you're at least on the path to it. Especially coming from more of a pagan background myself. We have a strong emphasis on this reality, this physical reality. We're here for a reason, we need to function in it. Second, so actual magical impact, is interesting because it hurts. It hurts for a moment, and usually people don't realize what it is. So they might think that it's like the flu or something like that. The closest I can compare it to is it feels, because I've had it. I've totally had it. Thinking I'm too big for my britches and trying magic that was just way out of my skill level.
So when you say magical impact, what do you mean exactly?
So it's like an overload of energy. Okay. It's more than you can handle. Okay. So it feels, from my experience, it feels sort of like if you've ever been in a car crash and then afterwards, like not a severe one, but like where you just have like, it's like this severe like whiplash. And then if you mix that sort of feeling with like a severe flu, it's like the weirdest thing. It's like a whiplash and like you're physically like hurt is the best word I can explain, but it goes away quickly. So a lot of people don't connect the dots that like, hey, this had something to do with the energy thing I did like yesterday or, a couple nights ago. It can also appear in different ways where people, a lot of it is very similar to looking at hippies from the 60s movement that fried themselves out and watching what they become later in life.
That's interesting. Yeah.
It's very, very similar. It's the same sort of like spaciness, the same inability to sort of function or take care of themselves in an adult way.
Yeah, that for me is one of the biggest blessings of the, even actually getting into occult stuff at all is that you have structure, and even just to be able to do something as simple as a banishing ritual where it's like you can put up about a psychic boundary. That's a big deal. People
Yes.
didn't have that in this for the most part in the 60s drug culture, and they still don't have it. And I like how you describe that. And I think it's very true when you say it's going to be apparent to other people before it's apparent to you.
Mm.
But maybe if you can share, if there's a way to share with people a warning sign to watch out for within themselves, that they're possibly they need to tone it down.
So for me, if we're going for less of the magical and more of the psychic, for me, it's the inability to shut, for example, spirits off. That is a big one. And a lot of people who like dabble into psychic stuff or who are kind of naturally predispositioned to be psychic end up kind of shutting themselves off automatically because they can't turn that off. And that's where I was talking about, it starts kind of borderlining how schizophrenia is described, of like hearing voices or like seeing things and not being able to shut it off, although my understanding is the nature of how that comes to you is very different. My understanding of schizophrenia, it's usually very angry or violent or negative, often.
That reminds me of something. This is really interesting because I mean, it's not exactly a scientific study. It was a anthropological survey of the voices reported by schizophrenic people in different cultures, and they found that when schizophrenics in particularly hardline Protestant cultures like England and America, but Western culture Western culture in general, get these angry, punishing, judging voices, whereas people from like India and Africa tend to experience like the gentle voices of tribal elders or people in their family, and it's not angry at all. That was super interesting to me.
Yeah. That's fascinating, and it kind of makes sense to me. I mean, that's our paradigm that we have in the West.
So, sorry, go ahead.
And then there's just other little things that like foundationally, I think we take for granted or aren't explained right or have kind of lost their meaning over time. Like one of the things that apparently is like a huge revelation with people that read my book, which then I was like, oh, this really isn't in any book, is it? Is the way that grounding is discussed in most books is not explaining, like usually it's more about like connecting with the earth and feeling rooted, and it's like that wasn't the original intent of grounding. It's supposed to be like a grounding wire, like it's your valve to let out the excess energy to flow through you.
What would an example of that be?
What do you mean?
So if you're talking about like having something like a grounding wire, what would an example of that be? Like a practice or a behavior or?
So for me, I'm very big on visualization, but visualization is just symbolic. So, when we're visualizing energetic things, even in ceremonial magic, essentially we're telling the energy what we want it to do and how we want it to move. It's not necessarily doing the thing. So a lot of it has to deal with what you are intending that visualization to do. So if you're grounding and you're just seeing your roots as just kind of anchoring you into the earth, that's what you're telling your energetic body to do, is like enter, like anchor, be solid. But if you're telling those energetic roots, like, hey, you're going to process energy that is too much for your system out through you into the earth, that gives it a different command.
Oh, wow. So you're basically talking about like literally visualizing yourself grounding.
Yes.
Like a tree.
Yes.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. That I have not heard. And that seems like it would be very helpful. I mean, I remember when I was going through it, people were constantly telling me, you need to be more grounded. You need to be more grounded. And I remember getting so frustrated, like, what the F are you actually talking about? And
sometimes they don't know.
They don't. And it's just it's just like, okay, well, I just feel judged,
Yes.
but it's kind of like, but I am big on some of the stuff that Dion Fortune recommends, like eating a heavier diet, exercising, cultivating friends outside of the magical community, playing a sport, doing things that are not involved in psychic or occult stuff, and just generally kind of being a better well-rounded, balanced person. I'm always for that.
I'm very mixed on Dion Fortune. Actually, I think
Right.
I'm mixed on pretty much any of that post-Victorian.
Oh no, it's interesting. I did a few episodes back. I did a podcast with Mickey Pellerano where we went back and revisited the mystical Kabbalah, and I was like, this is racist as hell. I don't remember it being this bad. It's like, it's ridiculous, like how over the top that book is. So yeah,
it's racist and anti-Semitic, and which is like hella ironic because it's a book on Kabbalah, you know?
Yeah, well, that was, I think, one of the biggest. I mean, Crowley was the same way. It's like it is, and people are still that way, unfortunately. Yeah. It's very ironic, but it was kind of shocking for me because like everyone, I remember just like, you know, everyone always points to Dion Fortune as the level-headed, sane one, and it's just like, yeah.
No, like even if you revisit psychic self-defense, you're like, she is paranoid. She's paranoid, and she says some things that like she just sounds crazy.
Yeah, like there's a thing about a werewolf attack in there, I think, and there's something like, I think at one point, no, I know what you're talking about because I looked at that recently. There's one part where she thinks that like one of her neighbors has like a door stopper shaped like a Buddha, and she thinks it's cursing her because it's from the evil Oriental cultures. It's like, calm down, like this is come on,
So and that's, you know, that's interesting because that I see it a lot more in the witchcraft and folk magic, but I'm sure it also happens in the ceremonial magic circles. But this sort of paranoia that grows and about each other, like everyone's cursing me, you know, all these things, you know, and there's a point where it's just sort of like, it seems like they snap, like Dion Fortune in that book seems like there's many instances where you're like, whoa, like that's not.
Yeah, and she was a Golden Dawn person, and they clearly snapped and went through that. Yeah.
And I always go back to, I love Terry Pratchett because I feel like Terry Pratchett often has a better understanding of witches than most witches do. And he had a concept of cackling. There's a certain point where a witch would start cackling, and that was where essentially they would break, they would snap inside, and they would start becoming paranoid of everyone around them, and they'd start cursing other people, you know, first as defense, like, oh, they're cursing me, so I got to curse them. And it just sort of becomes like a downward spiral. And
why do you think that happens?
I don't know. I don't know why, but it is definitely a phenomenon that I see a lot.
Yeah, I want to talk about that because
I think perhaps it might have to be a lack of accountability on the practitioner's end, you know, because sometimes you have to realize life sucks. You know, it doesn't have a magical reason for why bad things happen. Sometimes it's your fault. You were the one who set things in motion. Mundanely, that has come back to bite you. Sometimes
life is just hard. You know, it's like, it happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, and people always criticize historical occultists. It's like, look how hard their lives were. And I always say, like, look how hard the lives of all the people around them were also. It was a hard time to be alive, you know?
Yeah. They were mean to each other too. Like I was doing a deep dive back into like the foundational tarot texts. And it's interesting because like, you know, Eliphas Levi is like, oh, this is what like Court de Gebelin says, but he had it wrong. This is what it is, you know. And then you have Waite coming in, Arthur Waite, and you know he's like, oh, this is what Levi presented, but this is how he had it wrong, you know, like he was such an, it's so weird because like Waite is translating all this stuff and then he's talking shit the whole time,
and then about Crowley epically talk shit about Waite. So, yeah.
Exactly. Well, I mean, Crowley believed he was Levi, you know, so it's, but it actually kind of felt like when I was reading Crowley talking shit about Waite, it actually, I was kind of like, okay, this feels good because you read Waite's work and it's sort of like, this dude is like way too smug and way too arrogant, and to have someone like Crowley who is smug and is arrogant, put you in your place. At least he does it in kind of a a comical way. Whereas Waite
sure.
is just looking down,
Yeah, I never really went through a Waite phase, but I have enough of his books. Yeah, I would love to like focus on this a bit more, because certainly I've gone through that in various ways at various times in my life, and it happens on the internet also, not just in close proximity. It's like people get ideas, I can't, like, the list of weird ideas that people have about me, particularly other occult people. Like, I'm the devil to some people. It's just like, I'm literally just a D&D nerd just sitting here. But people get like the weirdest ideas about me. Maybe you have the same experience. I mean, it's like, and everyone kind of cultivates their persona online. And the thing about occult people is we're all basically the same. We're all basically like kids who were book smart in school or were interested in this stuff, and we're kind of outsidery and goth. Like, there's not really a whole lot of difference between occult people, but people build these personas and they get very paranoid about each other and things like that. And I've seen it happen in a lot of other people as well.
I think it happens more on online spaces too, or like, because I think like in-person community, I think you start realizing like, oh, most people get along in these spaces, and I think it's very much what you're saying. I think online there's a lot of projection and a lot of I've heard stuff about myself that I'm not going to repeat, but like stories and all kinds of statements where I'm like, I have no idea where this is coming from at all. I read stuff about myself and it's just like, you would think I'm like practically the head of the clan or something like that. It's like, what are you talking about? But I mean, to be fair, this is kind of just the nature of the internet in general. It's not really about, our whole culture is sick with people's insane projections. So it's certainly not just the occult scene. But I do think that with occult practices, you are making yourself more and more sensitive. So it would make sense that, that can lead to some hurt feelings as you become more and more sensitive, and hurt feelings about things that are not a big deal and what other people would not even notice. But when you really amp up your sensitivity, all of a sudden things can feel like an attack that are not. And I have that issue. So I haven't fully solved it, so. Yeah. I think it depends person to person. I mean, there are people that are legit wishing harm on people and are legit cursing people, whether their curses are doing anything or not, I guess that depends on the individual cursor. But yeah, I mean, you do become more sensitive, and I think, I don't know. I think it depends on what you're doing in this field and why you're doing it. I guess field is how I'm presenting it, because that's where I'm coming from. Like, this is my work. This is my life's work. This is my path. For other people, it's not. It's a very important part of their spiritual path, but it's not their life's work. And so I don't know. It's, I remember I had a student once. This was before I was even teaching, and I was just kind of mentoring, kind of like in the middle ground. And I already had my Patheos blog that was really big. I was already, trained in various traditions and like kind of known in my niche community. And they messaged me and they were like, oh, I'm very jealous of you and the teachers, which the tradition I'm talking about was, this one was Black Rose. So it was Storm Fairy Wolf and Devin Hunter, who have published books. And this person was like, oh, I'm very jealous that like everyone fawns over you and, buys your books and da, 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 da. And like that they aren't doing that for me. And I remember being like, well, that's weird, because you've been in this for a month and you said that this is your first experience with any of this.
Okay.
So it's just kind of like, well, I think some people don't realize how much we've put into this before becoming public.
or sacrificed or suffered, and yeah, I mean, I certainly get that. This is a crazy thing to make your life's work. It's an important thing to make your life's work,
Yeah.
but it's not like becoming a lawyer or a doctor,
Yeah.
and you face a lot of judgment.
Yeah. And, I've been very successful, which I feel very blessed, but that's also gotten a lot of evil eye my way,
Yeah.
like people jealous or people like thinking I don't deserve it or, things of that nature. So, and that can be sensitive, especially since I'm so supportive. Like I support everyone and I want to see everyone succeed who's doing good work. And, I think at the end of the day, for me, I just, I try to be a good person. I try to be good to other people, and I try to do what I feel is in alignment with my true will. And also help other people, if they're doing their true will, like more power to them. I'll support them. I'll, help them. But I think that, that sort of impeccability is an extreme word, but that integrity is a strong form of protection and a strong form of blessing on the path. And it's not like a huge secret. It's not like this huge mystery, but it's sort of like I don't know. Like I see a lot of these people that are complaining or are talking trash or whatever, and it's sort of like, well, you're doing the opposite of like what I and all the other successful occultists in history have said, which is essentially, like,
Yeah.
focus on your thing. And I think success is very, it's illusory. I mean, because like, what is success? Like, is it book sales? Is it subscribers? Is it podcast listens? Is it people you've affected? Is it people whose lives you've changed? We live in a very Western, very capitalist world where I think sometimes those things are confused.
Yeah. For me, I mean, I think a lot of it is just simply being in the public eye or being successful in general. It doesn't necessarily have to do with the occult scene, although occult people, let's face it, can be a little bit more unhinged at times.
Yes.
But no, I agree. And obviously I get a lot of that too. Less now because I'm much less social than I was as a result, unfortunately. Much less social. But there's always kind of particularly if you have a book out for some reason. I don't know why people get so hung up about that, but there's a lot of haters out there. And it really sucks, particularly if you come at this from a place of wanting to help people. It's like, look,
right,
I'm trying as hard as I can with everything I do to help you, and like you hate me for it. And it's like, well, that's an old story. Right. People just see someone else is getting attention and then maybe they start copying you. They want to like wear your skin, basically. That's also very disturbing.
But they, like I was saying, like they don't see all we've put into it, and they don't see like the not so positive aspects of this.
Yeah. They also don't see what they're doing to themselves with that attitude.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
A psychic said to me once something that was just so helpful for me and it was just really cool, that it's like, she said, just because somebody else has something doesn't mean you can't get it for yourself. Yeah, that's a big deal, because people think that it's like I think it's like that person has this, so I can't have what I want, which is not true.
Yeah. And I think that's something that like I've always had a different relationship with in general. Part of my background is New Thought. I do, occultists love to shit on New Thought, but it's like New Thought has a lot in common with a lot of the kind of basic principles of occultism.
It comes out of Hermeticism. It's a product of Hermeticism. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think,
interesting.
Being a child of, like poverty and struggle and stuff like that, like I kind of always grew up with the assumption that I wouldn't have anything, so I was always happy when someone had something, and I would celebrate their success and their victories, and I do that to this day. And if you go to a new thought person, they'll say like, well, that's how you do it, and so you put yourself in that vibration or that frequency. For me, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, or a little bit different. I think ultimately, like, I'm a big believer that we're all connected on a fundamental level, and that we are all one. And it's easy to say that. It's easy to, intellectually understand it. But I genuinely think we are. And I think that we essentially affect each other vibrationally, for lack of a better word, based on our interaction and our connections. And that includes physical and non-physical entities. In my second book, the way that I define witchcraft is I've come to understand it as the art of connection. And it's connection with spirit, connection with self, connection with other. And it's sort of tying into that mystery with the capital M, which is that we're all one. And it's a mystery because we can understand it intellectually, but to like experience it, or to get to know it, is a different experience than just intellectually understanding it. I think it's sort of like having a mushroom trip and then trying to explain to someone who's not had a mushroom trip what happened in the mushroom trip, and they can kind of follow along. They can kind of like have their idea of what the mushroom trip was like, but it's not the mushroom trip. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I love how you put that. And I think one of the great things about magic, sober magic and ceremonial, whatever, projective magic, let's just call it, is you do get a sense of cause and effect. And sometimes it can be really dramatic, and sometimes for the worse. It's like, you get to understand what karma is on a more direct level. And that demonstrates directly that principle, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, at my heart, like as I'm getting older, like I find Hermeticism, and even more than Hermeticism, if we were to get more specific, like alchemy, I feel like alchemy is like it. Like I feel like a lot of our stuff is based on alchemy, and alchemy has in its symbolic language pretty much the process, the mysteries, the keys.
Say more about that, please, because I really don't know a whole lot about alchemy, and it's been coming up on some recent podcasts, and people have been much more practiced and into it. And I'm a blank slate on that one, other than some of the basic concepts. So please say more about what you mean by that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can explain it more than a basic level. And it depends, because, different alchemists in different periods of time had different beliefs. So like, there's the idea of like the sacred alchemist and then kind of the profane alchemist. So like when the knowledge was lost and then they tried to physically, make the philosopher's stone. And then there's some people who believe that like they did both simultaneously. But essentially it's believed that alchemists spoke in what was referred to as the language of birds, which is this idea that, birds had the divine original language. And, some people think that comes from the ideas of Thoth in Egypt, so like that kind of divine wisdom.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. But essentially the language of birds, in reference to alchemy, is this idea of conveying things in a coded language, in a symbolism that would not get them executed by the church at the time, heretical ideas. So a lot of Hermeticism is in that. There's a lot of parallels to Hermeticism in terms of like the Hermetica. I'm not talking about like Golden Dawn Hermetics. I'm not talking about theurgy. I'm talking about like, the texts. And then alchemy was a encoded practical process of like, this is how you take the information and how you essentially change who you are. And so it's this process of refinement and introspection. And, this is why Jung was so fascinated with it, because it's individuation. It's individuation laid out as a map. It's the process of dismantling the self and then purposely rebuilding the self into something like Jung would call it an individual, which is different than how we use the word individual. Jung believed that most people were dividuals, that they were divided amongst themselves and didn't know themselves.
Wow.
So he came up with the term individuation to become an individual, like a self-made, cohesive person. And this has parallels to, and probably roots in some like Neoplatonic philosophy as well. But then it kind of ties into my own weird personal gnosis of the three souls, which are parallel to alchemy because they were working with the three prime essentials. They were working with the coded language was mercury, sulfur, salt, which was believed to be code for that tripart soul that Plato was discussing, of higher self, middle self, lower self. And so it's this idea of working with them and purifying them and seeing how they were opposites, but the opposites were the same thing in different degrees and kind of refining and breaking and destroying and rebuilding until you became something gold. And my own personal gnosis, I believe that when we do a process in witchcraft called soul alignment, which is where we essentially center all three parts of ourselves to the best of our ability, to be fully magically present and essentially switched on. My belief is that you are it is very abstract. So I want to say solidifying, but it's not solidifying at all because there's nothing solid about it. But essentially, you're weaving a tapestry of your soul to essentially create what New Agers might call a light body. Eastern people might call a rainbow body. Early Western church mystics might have called, a glory. But essentially, you're creating a vehicle to hopefully, in one of these incarnations, become one of the mighty dead, which is someone who has essentially gotten off of the cycle of rebirth. And we see this theme in a lot of different other traditions. We see it in Buddhism with bodhisattvas. We see it with saints, with Catholics. It's almost like an old universal thing that's said in different ways. And a lot of that has to deal also with, my Neoplatonic interest. The Neoplatonists were very big on the idea that the mission of man was essentially to stop reincarnating and to essentially join the abode of the gods. And so I went on a total tangent.
No, that's great. Let's keep talking about this. I mean, it's super interesting. And certainly it's something that you see across cultures. If you want to revisit that topic from like a more practical and less theoretical angle, just like, how am I trying to say this? Mm-hmm. Like in your lived experience, do you find that is a real thing? And if so, how?
I don't know. So okay. This is one of the areas where it's sort of like, I have to go on faith because obviously I'm not an ascended entity. I'm still a very flawed person going through my own self-development and my own refinement. I'm still turning into gold from lead. But if I were to look at all these influences that have impacted what I do as a magician, as a witch, I trace it back far enough and there's this belief. So I have to believe that there is some sort of merit to it. It may not even be this lifetime because it's not necessarily a single lifetime thing. So yeah, at the most, what it can do is it can bring you closer to what Jung calls individuation, which is a self-made person, someone who is more in control of their subconscious complexes. so to speak, so that you're not being subconsciously driven by your trauma or your responses, but you are reacting as a self-made individual. And that ties into the concept, which in a lot of witchcraft traditions, they're very big on the idea of sovereignty, which is this idea that you are responsible for your life and for your impact of your life. And I'm not saying you're responsible for things that have happened to you in your past, but you are responsible for how you respond to things and how that response impacts everything in your life.
I like that.
So there's practical benefits, even if we're not jumping off the wheel of rebirth, because I can't prove that.
Right.
I can't. That is all theoretical. That's all hope.
I love the phrase you used, individuals. I haven't heard that before, but and I hadn't made the connection between that and individual. That really says it all.
Jung is one of my big loves.
Okay.
I love Jung. Jung's writing actually helped me understand Crowley a lot more.
Oh, interesting. In what sense?
Oh, there's so much that's paralleled. And I think it's because they were both very into the same things. They were both very into alchemy. They were both very into Neoplatonism. And so like they make a lot of the same references, but Crowley would often present it in a very cryptic way, like this is what Eowas has bestowed upon me as the prophet, yes. And so Jung's like, yeah, so this is this thing, and you'll see a lot of the same terminology, like the point in the circle, and like the rising serpent. Like there's a lot of the language that comes straight from alchemy that Crowley uses, and a lot of the things that Crowley is expounding upon, particularly in Book of the Law, I feel is essentially alchemy, and it's the alchemy of the self. And I think that there's this trip that I find a lot of occultists have, which is this sort of duality in their mind. And I don't mean between good and bad, but between something being this way or that way, and not and.
Yes, that does make sense. Absolutely.
So like, I'm sure you've read Book of the Law.
A couple times.
Yes. So for me, that is discussing three divinities, right? But it's also discussing the three parts of ourselves, because it's all macrocosm, microcosm. And so the whole thing is a mission statement of that individuation, that alchemy, that ascension process. And it's a war, it's a battle against the self, right? But it's phrased in a way that it's a battle against others, a war against others. And it is in a sense as well, because we're all connected, and it's it's a paradigm shift. But yeah, like another thing that like I find infinitely fascinating is Crowley's relationship with Eowas and Jung's relationship with Philemon. So Philemon we know about because of the Red Book, which came out many years after his death. And it was like this huge revelation, because it's like, oh, Jung was like going through all this stuff he theorized in secret and no one knew about, And his main guide, his teacher, his daemon that came to him was Philemon, this older sage type person. And Jung would have arguments with Philemon because Jung switches. And that's the thing people don't get is Jung, you have to know which part of his life he's talking about. But there is this part in the Red Book where Jung is arguing with Philemon about how Philemon is just a part of his subconscious, that he's like, Philemon, you are part of my subconscious. You're an aspect of myself. Da, da, da. And Philemon's like, no, I'm not, dude. Like, I'm here, whether you exist or not. Like, I am here, and it's interesting because Crowley has the same struggle with Eowas. Is Eowas my higher self, or is it the holy guardian angel? Is it part of me? Is it something external? And this is the same battle that Jung was having with Philemon. And I think they're both wrong.
How so?
Well, I think that they're doing the and versus or. And I think it's more of an and, it's a particle and a wave. It's separate and it is self. Um, it's self in the sense that like it is so connected to you. So if you look at the idea of the daemon in like a Greek or the Roman genius, right? Like it's assigned to you for your lifetime. Like, and that sense of interaction, I mean, it might as well be a part of yourself. Uh, I think it's kind of a moot point when fundamentally I believe that we all are one on one level. If we're all cells in something bigger, then yes, it's like you and I, like we would be like, no, we're not the same person, obviously, but like our higher selves may have a disagreement about that, on a higher level. We might be. It's just like the cells in my body. Like if they could speak, they'd probably be like, oh, me and that other cell are not the same. And they may not even have a concept of who Matt is as a full
Right.
entity.
Well, I like
And
I
so,
like the concept of a body or a larger being, because if you look at us as all cells in a larger body, I mean, certainly people like you or I, or a lot of the people we know are basically the same type of cell performing the same function,
yes.
and there's not, the differences are mostly cosmetic. And that is super interesting. But I want to, you said something that I wanted to circle back to, unless you wanted to wrap that up first. Okay.
No, I don't even remember where I was going with that.
There,
I'm just geeking out.
Oh
So
yeah. No, this is great. This is the wonderful thing about podcasts. It's like, it's not sound bites. It just goes where it goes. And usually that's the most interesting thing. But you said something that I wanted to go back to, which is you were talking about the Book of the Law, and you were saying that there is the war, the internal war, but there's also an external war, and you connected it to cultural change. And I was curious what you meant by that.
well, I mean, a lot of the way that I interpret the Book of the Law, which is forbidden to interpret, for that exact reason is why it's forbidden, is this idea of dogmatism, because Thelema is highly individualistic.
Yeah, and I also find every time I read it, I have a different interpretation of it, and it changes based on where you are in your life and your path and initiation and all of that. So, yeah,
Absolutely.
but carry on.
Yeah. I totally agree. But what I mean by that is like you look at a lot of the language and it's very anti-Christian, but it's not anti-Christianity. So there's the whole like, Huck pecking out the eyes of Jesus on the cross, and that has more to do with like, for my understanding, it has more to do with aeon revolution and aeon changing and the social paradigm changing. And I think that that's essentially the war. It's not the war in the sense of like extremism, but it's essentially this war of essentially, I think it boils down to, I really like the quote about Crowley, by Crowley, where he says, Thelemites are infinitely tolerant, save for intolerance. And I feel like that's what the war is on. Essentially the denial of other people's true will.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's what that paradigm shift is, because the Aeon of Osiris, as you would call it, was very much about, like, this is what everyone should do. Not.
Yeah. Well, that's a very real war. Like I live in Texas. That's a real war, and and it's a war that's being fought every day in America, and it's a war that I thought had been won, and definitely has not. And that's interesting. It's like, and I do see it in terms of Aeon of Osiris. It's like you look at things like, evangelical, like the Westboro Baptist Church or something like that, and it's just like, how does this even still exist? It's so, it's just like so against the current of reality. It's got to be so hard to maintain that as well, because life is so much easier when you just let people be.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's also very easy to be spoon-fed. And I think that has more to do with it than allowing other people. It's the fact that they're spoon fed that like they're doing it wrong. And so we have to attack them. Because when you have the answers, quote unquote, like nicely packaged and organized and handed to you, as long as you don't question it too much, then like that's a fairly easy life, as opposed to having to search and having to find, like what is real to me or what is probable to me based off my experiences. But I don't know, like I think I even see a lot of what I call the Aeon of Osiris, and even a lot of Thelema in how people interact with, not so much to the level of like Westboro Baptist or, like crazy alt-right people, but there it's interesting reading how much Crowley puts an emphasis on like don't do exactly what I'm doing, like follow your own path, and then like seeing Thelemites getting kind of dogmatic about it,
right? And I think now they want to completely edit him out of Thelema, which is also, I think, kind of too far in the other direction. It's like, how does that compute? But yeah, Crowley obviously problematic, as we would say now. But also, the point of Thelema is not to be Crowley; it's to be yourself. And I find that the Thelemic principles, let's say, not organized Thelema, okay, but like the principles of reality as outlined in the Book of the Law. It's not just that that's the best way to live; it's kind of the only way to live that works. Like you were mentioning earlier, just buckling down and focusing on what you perceive your true will to be instead of worrying about other people. That's the only way you're going to get anywhere that makes you happy, whatever that is. But also fundamentally understanding that everyone else is doing the same thing, and their answers maybe will be totally different from yours. And I love your thing about "and," because that's also so critical to interpersonal communication. It's like you can believe something, I might not agree with it, but I also believe something, and we can both have our beliefs, and that's totally fine.
And they can both be right. So like,
or both be wrong, but yeah, totally, yeah.
One of my big takeaways in witchcraft, and I put this in Psychic Witch, is that I believe the heart of witchcraft, or you could even say occultism, is paradox, and being able to hold that paradox. And that's one of the weirdest thing when I see this like right versus wrong, or this or that kind of mentality. We should at least entertain holding multiple possibilities of,
yes,
what is going on and what the big truths are, because no one knows for sure. Like, I mean, you can be Siddhartha and achieve enlightenment, but like, how are you going to prove to someone else that you didn't have a psychotic break, and that you have the wrong answers?
Well, by giving them a system to repeat your experience, which I think Buddhism did pretty well. But, good luck finding people who will take it that far.
But that also doesn't mean that like Buddhism is the only path, or that it's, that the only path for reaching there, that state, or that's necessarily where everyone needs or should be going. And I think it goes back to like an Aeon thing. Like, I love Buddhism. Like, I'm not like trying to, it was just the first example that came to mind. But I really love what Crowley says about, I love his star analogy with true will, and the idea that no stars, I forgot how he words it, but they don't essentially like cross each other's paths. Like, when everyone's doing their true will, there is no interference, there is no clashing. And
yeah, and I think that that's correct, and it's always crazy to me how viscerally real a lot of the Book of the Law has become. I mean, even just on the nose stuff like every man and woman is a star. It's like, well, okay, there's kids making 7 figures on Twitch. There's YouTube. There's Mr. Beast. There you go, the Beast, Mr. Beast 666 with 18 billion followers on YouTube, and everyone is now the center of attention simultaneously. And of course, we're going crazy as a culture because we don't know how to handle it, and technology is bringing it on so fast. And just if people were to accept the most basic magical thing, like the Robert Anton Wilson idea of reality tunnel, how helpful would that be for like all the cultural wars? And it's like, look, we could both be just seeing reality as we see ourselves. It's like we're just in different reality tunnels. We don't all need to be in the same reality tunnel. It's totally fine, but people, you get people on both sides of the political fence, at least in the US, playing like, scorched earth zero-sum game. And it's exhausting, I think, particularly for magical inclined people, because it's so far from what, what we know is possible. So.
Yeah. Yeah. And like going with the every man and every woman is a star. So like, this is another one of those paradoxes, like Thelema and True Will is very individual. It's highly individualistic, but we're all stars within Nuit. Like I was saying, cells in a body. So it's not about the individual, but it is about the individual. And I don't know. I think it's easy to get lost in one or the other. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I like about witchcraft is this emphasis on the crooked path, which could be termed very similarly to the Buddhist middle path, with kind of a similar idea. This idea of, I think that's why I'm very against the or. What? This or that.
Oh, okay. I thought for some reason I was imagining a literal oar in a boat. It's like, wait, yeah. What's the oar?
Yeah. Or it could be a metal, because we were talking about alchemy.
Yes. Have you looked at Nemo's stuff at all? Like Mott magic?
A little bit. I have not read all of Mott magic. I think she also has another one. It's like Pan something, which I haven't read.
She wrote one that has the word mystery in it somewhere. All of her stuff is brilliant, and I'm very sad that I could not get her on the podcast before she died. But
I like her work more than Kenneth Grant's, and to my understanding, that was her upstream person.
Yeah, well, she's an interesting one because she had kind of her own Book of the Law download, which was the Book of Mott, or the Liber Pene Penumbra in the late 60s, and Kenneth Grant kind of championed it and then kind of went off on his own Kenneth Grant tangent of writing books about the Gematria and stuff. I love Kenneth Grant. He's mostly just for vibe inspiration. It's like, as long as you don't take him too seriously. But Mott, that book Mott Magic is just a wiser paperback. It's really hard to get now, and it's really expensive, which is crazy. Somehow how expensive so many of these books are that were like $5 when I bought them. But she talks about the concept of Naton, like Naton, with an apostrophe after the N, which is this idea that in the Aeon of Mott after Horus, everyone has. It's like you were talking about. It's like when everyone does their true will, it works out perfectly. So basically she says that at that point, all of the friction has been removed from the system. Everyone is perfectly doing their true will. And then the entirety of humanity wakes up as this one hive consciousness, Naton, which is cool.
And then we're Borg.
And then exactly. We're the Borg hive. And then we go and cause trouble for other cultures across the universe. But I always thought that was...
I like that.
Very cool.
It's interesting. Without reading it or having a strong opinion, that sounds very interesting.
Yeah,
and I'll check it out.
She's very underrated, and I
people don't know who she is.
Yeah, and that's tragic because I think she's such a big part of the puzzle as well, and I'm glad we're talking about it. Because it would also be a shame if her work gets lost now that she has passed. But that whole crew put out so much stuff, like that Cincinnati occult crew in the 60s and 70s, Denny Sargent and all of the people that came out. I think Don Craig may have passed through that at least at one point as well.
I didn't know Denny Sargent was in that circle.
Oh yeah, he was part of her or presumably is still part of her magical group.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So he's a Llewellyn author. So
Oh yeah, yeah. And I
yeah.
think Linda
So,
Florio as well. I forget the name. They had a couple different names for their groups in the
hmm.
70s. Somebody sent me all their zines from the 70s, like the Cincinnati Journal of Ceremonial Magic, and it's great.
Oh,
It's
that's
like
cool.
super out there. Yeah, interesting stuff. Well, this has been a great conversation. I think we pretty much we pulled every thread, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about stuff that has nothing to do with my books, but that
Well,
is
let's bring it back to your books. Where
no,
can
no,
people
no, no.
find
I'm
them?
actually saying that's refreshing.
Oh, good. Yeah, yeah.
Because after a while, you get tired of saying the same things over and over
Totally.
about
Totally.
your books.
Yeah, no,
But
this podcast is this is the Hangout podcast. But we should bring it back to your books. Where can people find them and find out more about you?
pretty much anywhere. So Psychic Witch and Mastery Magic are both available directly through Llewellyn or Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, anywhere books are sold. I have a book co-authored with Evo Dominguez Jr. coming out this year, Pisces Witch. It's part of Llewellyn Zodiac series. And then I have another book which I haven't and am not allowed to announce yet. That will be in the fall catalog for Llewellyn. People can find me on social media, Matt Auryn, MATAURYN. No spelling variations, no periods, no underscores. I will not message you asking you to pay for a reading.
Yeah, I've seen that's going on.
Yeah, it's enough to want to quit social media.
Oh man. But I'm curious though, just because from my own curiosity, with Psychic Witch and Mastering Magic, what order should those be read in, and what kind of content is covered in each?
So they can be read either order. I wrote Psychic Witch first. I think Psychic Witch gives a better foundation, but people find it harder than Mastering Magic. In Mastering Magic, I also started by answering some of the biggest feedback that I got, which was people with ADHD or people with aphantasia, which is the inability to visualize, because Psychic Witch is so visually heavy. So I discuss how to get into alpha through other means. It's hard because Psychic Witch is so foundational that any book that I write is going to have to give a watered down See Psychic Witch for this full development, Psychic Witch is my whole premise is, as I said, that psychic ability and magic are two sides of the same coin. I believe that every human is born psychic. I believe that psychic ability is essentially the language of spirit. It's how we experience and how we communicate before we're incarnated. We have it while incarnated, and we have it after we discarnate. And I think it goes dormant in a lot of people, but it can be reawoken. It is natural. All of the senses can be awoken. And once you learn the process of awakening that, you can essentially reverse engineer that to do magic. For lack of a better word, I say on the spot. Some people say instant, but essentially that kind of mind magic, which is more than just sort of, like wishing something, but is essentially using that process of how psychic information comes to you and then turning it into an output. So Psychic Witch is very strong on, no tools, not a lot of ritual. It's more about just the process. Whereas Mastering Magic is the other side of the coin. So it's all about, how do you do magic? How can you make magic effective that has results? So it's a lot of my tried and true, trial and error things that I learned that make, your magic either successful or not. And the book's goal is the spell examples that I give while I'm teaching are all focused mostly on psychic empowerment. So hopefully I'm creating a circuit that feeds, both sides of those things and helps someone become a more powerful, for lack of a better word, magician and psychic.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for having the conversation. And now people know where to get your books. And thank you again for being on.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun, Jason.
All right. Hope you really, really enjoyed that. I definitely had a lot of fun in that conversation. Meet us at magick.me, magick.me, my school for magic, meditation, and mysticism, where you can learn all the skills you need to unleash your true self. I will see you in class, and until next time, hang in there.